Before we get into the video, I'd just like to give a huge shout out to EA for providing me with a Dead Space Remake code for this review. After having spent about 12 hours with the new Dead Space Remake, beating it once on normal, and starting another New Game Plus playthrough, I have to say it is surprisingly good. I wanted to cover this game on release because I spent so much time on the Dead Space series. This video is going to be much shorter than my normal ones, but I didn't want to make a massive deconstruction of a game that isn't even out yet. Primarily because I didn't want to spoil this entire thing, but that being said, if you want to be surprised as to the changes that Dead Space Remake introduces, I wouldn't watch this video. I also will be referencing the original Dead Space in this video quite a lot, and will probably spoil certain parts of the story for both games. If you haven't played Dead Space before and are interested in the remake, I'd recommend you go play it. If you have played Dead Space and don't care about spoiling the changes to the game, then continue on. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I want to talk about the Dead Space Remake. Like I said before, the Dead Space Remake is actually surprisingly good. If you don't know what Dead Space is, it's a survival horror game released in 2008. It was a fantastic experience full of terror and suspense. I have to eat crow a little bit here, because if you've seen my previous retrospective on the Dead Space series, I capped that video off with a bit of a prediction. I was looking forward to the release of the Callisto Protocol, and not so much the remake of Dead Space. I had my reasons for this. Glenn Schofield, the creator of Dead Space, was helming Callisto Protocol, and it seemed like that game was going to be great. The Dead Space remake, however, seemed to be just retreading old ground. Now, I never did play Callisto based on the early impressions and reviews, but as you probably know, Callisto wasn't very well favored. If I would have put money on my predictions at the end of my Dead Space retrospective, I would have lost that money, because this is a pretty great remake. The changes it makes to gameplay and story are both slight and impactful. The game manages to stay true to the spirit of the original game while also improving on the structure and formula to give us, in some ways, a superior product. So what exactly are these changes? There are a myriad of changes made to levels and design of environments, and this video will by no means go through every one of them. Certain moments have been changed to either fix things fans had been bothered with in the original, or to modernize the game slightly. This is never overdone though, and it always feels like welcome change. I'm sure there will be some Dead Space purists out there who won't like these changes, but for the most part I think they're welcome. An example of a smaller change that I enjoyed was the ADS cannon section. We no longer are seated and shooting at asteroids, we have to travel to the hull of the ship and fly around, calibrating the ADS cannons by aiming our tool out into space. This adds another element to the sequence and mostly fixes it, in my opinion. If you saw my retrospective on the first game, you'll know I didn't really care for shooting asteroids in Dead Space. Like I said, there are a ton of small changes, but in my opinion, there are three really large ones that affect either story or gameplay heavily. The first of these is the layout of the Ishimura. In the first game, each mission starts and ends at the tram station. The tram whisks us away to a new area, and we begin our mission of fighting off necromorphs and fixing the planet cracker. When we're done, we get back on the tram and it takes us somewhere else. The remake changes this heavily. The entire ship is now interconnected. Once we unlock part of it, we can travel back to it at any given time. The tram is now solely used to travel to different decks, but we can walk to most of them without using the tram at all. This reduces quite a bit of backtracking that we had to do in the original. It also makes for a much better story. It feels like we're taking a path across the ship rather than running in and out of new areas. Why might we want to head back to any given part of the ship, though? Well, we now explore locked rooms that usually require a certain level of security clearance to get access to. There are 3 levels of access that we gain as we make our way through the story. Once you gain a certain level of access, it might behoove you to run back to another part of the ship and unlock rooms to get extra equipment, weapons, or upgrades. It actually encourages you to explore quite a bit and adds another element to the game entirely. The entire structure change was probably one of my favorite parts about the remake. There's actually a moment early on when the Kellion explodes and we end up flying through the cargo bay to get to the next part of the mission rather than returning to the tram, and it really makes the game feel a lot more open. Speaking of this moment, if you go looking for Peng here, you won't find it. Only a note from a crazed crew member talking about where they hid Peng. That's right, the classic Dead Space Easter egg has changed spots, since it doesn't really make sense to give you Peng this early into the adventure. I won't spoil exactly where you can find it, I'll leave that up to you to find out. I will say though, it's not as hidden as I thought it would be. I spent most of the game thinking about where it could be and searching every corner of every room, only to find it in a pretty obvious spot. It's still cool that they changed it though. The second big change that the remake makes is Isaac himself. The developers decided to have Isaac talk in this entry. When I originally heard the news about this, I didn't like it at all. If you look back at Schofield's philosophy when making Dead Space, he had very specific reasons for Isaac not saying a word in the original. He felt like it gave the player another level of immersion, being able to supplant themselves into the character. Because of this extra level of immersion, it's then easier to terrify us. We feel like we are the character, not just moving a 3D model around on a screen. But when I played the game, I realized that I really didn't mind it that much at all. It's pretty clear that the developers wanted to remake Dead Space, but just make it a bit more like Dead Space 2. The jetpacking feels like Dead Space 2, the story feels like Dead Space 2, Isaac talking, the structure change, but it honestly adds a good amount of context to a lot of situations. Being able to know what Isaac is thinking and hearing, his responses to the other team members, does add a different element. I will say that it certainly does change the vibe of things overall. You do lose a little bit of that agency when we're playing a character that has opinions, a backstory, and speaks. The third large change I'd like to talk about is the story itself. So they do change the story a bit in Dead Space, but it's not really in the way that you'd think. One of the biggest changes is that in general, unitology is just referenced a lot more than in the original. The reason for this, I think, is they're trying to set themselves up nicely for a sequel, just in case this game does well. This is honestly kind of smart and makes a lot of sense from the developer's point of view. I can't really say for certain, but I also feel like it'll make the jump from Dead Space to Dead Space 2 feel like less of a shift, but we'll have to wait and see for that one. Most of the story stays very much the same. A lot of the big iconic moments we remember happen in just about exactly the same way as before. There are slight changes like Mercer trapping Isaac in stasis before releasing the Hunter. Nothing too big or monumental. Some other changes have been made in the service of the story itself. For example, in the hydroponics area, Elizabeth Cross guides us through this space. She actually plays a larger role in the story after this as well, but that's at the end and I don't want to spoil it. But the hydroponics section is bettered by this addition because it feels like we're following someone's story. Introducing another character like this furthers to break up the overall story a bit more as well. It's not something I absolutely love, but I don't really hate it either. It just makes sense and doesn't really change the game overall. The other addition to story changes are side quests. We get side quests in Dead Space that send us exploring across the Ishimura in search of answers to certain mysteries. One of these has to do with Nicole and tracking her research across the ship. The other one allows us to achieve the final level of security clearance to unlock super hidden rooms on the ship. These are a fine addition. It's something else to do, and I think the Nicole side quest further contextualizes her as a character. It actually brings us closer to her as a player, and the reveals throughout the game hit a little harder that way. Other than that, for the most part, the story remains unchanged. There are a ton of other slight differences, but I don't really think they're that monumental. They also usually seem to be added to add characterization to people rather than just retcon things. There is an alternate ending to the game. This was revealed a few days ago when the trophies were released. I'll be honest, I didn't find the alternate ending, and judging by the trophy unlock percentage on PlayStation, I don't think anyone else has either. I honestly didn't get as much time to play the game as I would have liked, which is another reason for the length of the video. My suspicion is that the alternate ending has to do with New Game Plus, because when you start that up, it says that there are other stories to find, but that mystery will remain undiscovered for now. There are some other highlights to the remake that I haven't talked about. For example, the graphics are stunning. The game looks quite beautiful in general, and the graphical upgrade is just fantastic. Lighting is great here and furthers the horror atmosphere in general. The game is still scary, by the way. It's just as terrifying and fun to play as the original. I was still clutching the controller when running away from enemies or when I would hear thumps in the other hallways. It really holds up the survival horror aspect of the original game. I will say, like many others, I'm not a huge fan of the character models, but I think that comes down to personal preference. I am willing to concede that this may just be because I'm so used to the previous models, and not because the new ones are actually bad. Speaking of horror, the game introduces a new element that I really liked. This is circuit boards. At certain points, we'll have to power up doors, elevators, or machinery that we need to advance the mission. Diverting power means we might have to take away from other equipment though, like the lights. Being forced to turn off the lights to further your goal and then having to run back through a room in the dark chased by necromorphs from every direction is just terrifying. Putting this choice in your hands, though, and forcing you to turn off the lights honestly makes it a lot scarier than the game just doing it for you. There are also certain moments where you can choose to turn off the oxygen or the lights. The oxygen might make your journey back harder, but at least it won't be as terrifying. I just love this mechanic so much, and I honestly thought it should have been used more in the game. It became a lot less common towards the second half, and I really wish they would have utilized it more. The combat still feels fantastic, and they haven't touched the upgrade system too much. There are weapon upgrades that allow us to access more nodes on the bench, but other than that, it's the same system as before. Find nodes and use them to unlock upgrades for our weapons and suit. Slicing up necromorphs feels just as satisfying as it did in the original. I used the Ripper and Flamethrower a ton in this entry because they were just so fun to use. Burning enemies to the ground, taking out whole groups with ricocheting blades, it's all really fun and it keeps that same pace that the original game had. Overall, the Dead Space Remake is fantastic. I really enjoyed my time with it, and when I started playing it, I just couldn't put it down. Even if I wasn't making a video on it, I would have just kept playing because it was so good. It really rides the line between being faithful to the original and updating the game for modern audiences. I don't really enjoy remakes overall. I think most of the time they're unnecessary. They're usually just used as a cash grab, an easy way for a company to make some extra money. They also usually go way too far, either changing too much or too little. I wasn't extremely confident in the Dead Space remake, especially because I didn't think the original game really needed remade. It still looks pretty good today. It plays very well. It doesn't feel incredibly outdated, like a game from an old world. But I'm actually happy to say that I was wrong. It actually feels like the developers respected the original entry. Not only that, but they respected the fans enough to give them a remake that is worthy of their attention. They didn't just phone it in to try and get some extra revenue. This is how remakes should be done. Upgrade the game visually, pull out the things that don't work, and replace them with genuinely new and interesting things. At the same time, know why the first game was good in the first place and capture that spirit that fans loved. That's exactly what the Dead Space remake does, and if you're a fan of the series or interested in checking it out, I would highly recommend picking it up. Bye, Dad. Hey Dad, I just wanted to say thanks for watching this video. As you can tell, I wanted to try out something new with this video. I had enough requests to cover the Dead Space remake that I figured I would make a video on it anyways, but that became a lot easier when EA sent me an early review code for the game. I want to do more of these shorter reviews for newer games, hopefully not always this short, but I didn't have a ton of turnaround time for this one, to be honest. I want to know what you think, though. Let me know in the comments if you like this video and if you want to see me talk about more new games in the future. Bye, Dad.